30 feet beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, in a concrete tomb where sunlight has never penetrated and never will, Adolf Hitler exists in a space between life and death. The year is 1945. The month is April. And above this underground fortress, Berlin burns. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. Consider what it means to descend beneath the earth, to leave the natural world behind, and enter a realm constructed entirely by human hands. The Führerbunker represents the final refuge of a regime that sought to reshape reality itself, and now reality has come calling. Every few minutes, Soviet artillery strikes shake the walls. Plaster dust falls like artificial snow in corridors that smell of diesel generators, human sweat, and something else, something psychological that witnesses will later struggle to describe. The scent of endings. 22 rooms contain what remains of Nazi power. The structure itself tells a story, reinforced concrete walls 16 feet thick, designed to withstand direct bomb hits, built to preserve life in a world of death. Yet now it serves as something quite different. A cage. A waiting room. A stage for history's strangest final act. The man who shuffles through these corridors bears little resemblance to the figure who once commanded armies across continents. Hitler's left arm trembles constantly from Parkinson's disease. His walk has become stooped, uncertain, as though the weight of gravity itself presses harder upon him than upon others. He steadies himself against concrete walls that remain forever cold, despite the press of bodies, despite the running generators, despite everything human that unfolds within. Witnesses, those who survive to tell, describe a transformation so complete it seems almost supernatural. The charismatic leader who mesmerized crowds, who commanded through sheer force of personality, has become something else entirely. His eyes, they say, no longer focus on the present. They look through people, through walls, toward something invisible, perhaps toward the future that will judge him, perhaps toward nothing at all. Nature abhors such places. The bunker exists in defiance of every natural principle: no light, no air circulation beyond mechanical systems, no connection to the living world above. Humans were not meant to exist 30 feet underground, breathing recycled air, sleeping without knowing day from night. The psychological toll proves immense. People begin to lose track of time. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours collapse into moments. The usual markers that orient human consciousness, sunrise, sunset, the changing quality of light, all these natural rhythms vanish. And yet, life persists. Even here, even in this most unnatural of spaces, humans continue their rituals. They eat. They sleep. They fall in love. On April 29, 1945, while Soviet shells explode in the garden 40 feet overhead, Adolf Hitler marries Eva Braun in the bunker's map room. Imagine that scene for a moment. Municipal Councillor Walter Wagner, pulled from a nearby Volkssturm unit, conducts the brief civil ceremony. The bride wears black silk black, not white, as though she already mourns what must follow. Both sign their names in a registry that will become one of the last authenticated documents from Hitler's hand. Eva starts to sign her maiden name, hesitates, crosses it out, writes Eva Hitler instead. She will bear this name for fewer than 24 hours. The ceremony lasts 10 minutes. They drink champagne afterward in the conference room, toasting to nothing in particular. What do you toast when the world above burns, when artillery shells explode with metronomic regularity, when everyone present knows what must come next? They toast anyway. Humans maintain their rituals even when rituals have lost all meaning, perhaps especially then. The final day, April 30th, unfolds with the terrible momentum of natural law. In the early morning hours, Hitler dictates his political testament to Secretary Traudl Junge. He appoints Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, expels Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party, attributes Germany's defeat to international Jewry. The testament represents his final attempt to control narrative, to shape how history will remember these events. He cannot know, though perhaps he suspects that history will remember quite differently. By mid-afternoon, Soviet forces fight 3 blocks away. Machine gun fire echoes through subway tunnels connected to the bunker system. The sound carries through concrete, through earth, finding its way into rooms where people wait. The Red Army approaches not like a distant storm, but like an incoming tide, inevitable, unstoppable, driven by forces far larger than any individual will. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, though time has become fluid in this sunless world, gunshots sound from Hitler's private suite. A small sitting room, a bedroom, the most private space in this warren of concrete. And here, accounts begin to diverge in ways that will never completely reconcile. Valet Heinz Linger later states he discovered Hitler slumped on a sofa, blood dripping from his right temple, a Walther pistol nearby. Eva Braun sits beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning, her body exhaling the bitter almond scent characteristic of that particular poison. But other witnesses recall different details. Some remember Hitler wrapped in a blanket. Others insist both bodies lay exposed, visible to all who entered. Some heard 2 shots minutes apart. Others swear they heard only one. This fragmenting of testimony, it begins immediately. Not years later, not through the distortion of memory over decades, but within minutes of the event itself. The human mind, when confronted with trauma, with endings, with moments too large to fully comprehend, begins to fracture. Different people, standing in the same space, seeing the same scene, will later describe different realities. This tells us something profound about the nature of truth itself, about how difficult it becomes to establish certainty even when witnesses are present, even when events occur in enclosed spaces before multiple observers. Guards carry the bodies up narrow concrete stairs into the Chancellery garden. Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, several others whose names will appear in testimonies that contradict each other in small but significant ways. They emerge into what remains of the garden, a moonscape of bomb craters, splintered trees, scattered rubble from buildings that once housed the machinery of governance. Someone has prepared a shallow depression in the ground. Not a grave, exactly. More of a depression where earth has been disturbed, where a space has opened to receive what must be placed there. The bodies lie in this improvised space, while gasoline, precious fuel normally reserved for Germany's last vehicles, soaks the corpses. Witnesses describe pouring approximately 40 gallons over the remains. 40 gallons. Imagine the logistics involved. Finding that much gasoline in a besieged city where every drop of fuel might power a vehicle might enable someone's escape. The cremation burns for hours in the open air, as Soviet artillery continues its methodical destruction of everything above ground. Smoke rises into the grey Berlin sky, one more column among thousands. Those who watch from the bunker entrance, standing just inside the threshold between underground and above, between shelter and exposure, report seeing flames. But they also describe something else, how difficult it proves to completely consume human remains with gasoline alone. This is a fact of nature that romantic notions of cremation often overlook. Bodies don't burn like wood. The human form contains too much water, too much material resistant to flame. Bones, especially bones, require sustained temperatures above 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit to completely incinerate. An open-air fire with gasoline reaches perhaps 1,400 degrees at peak intensity, but only briefly, and only at the flame's heart. The fire cools rapidly. What remains after hours of burning? This question will haunt investigators for decades, because the answer determines everything. Complete cremation leaves only ash identifiable through chemical analysis, perhaps, but offering little for traditional forensic examination. Partial cremation leaves fragments, bones, teeth, tissue that might be identified through comparison with dental records, through pathological examination, through all the tools that forensic science possesses. The difference matters immensely. Soviet forces reached the Chancellery on May 2, 1945. 3 days after Hitler's reported death. 3 days during which the bunker has been abandoned in stages, various groups fleeing through subway tunnels at different times, each carrying whatever they could carry, each hoping to slip through the tightening Soviet encirclement. The Red Army finds a labyrinth of rooms strewn with documents, personal effects, empty champagne bottles, the detritus of collapsed power. In the garden, they discover what their initial reports describe as partially burned human remains in a shallow crater. Partially burned. Not ash, not completely consumed, but fragments blackened, damaged, disturbed by the artillery shells that continued falling even after the cremation ended. Material sufficient for examination. Material insufficient for easy identification. And here at this moment, when Soviet soldiers stand in the garden looking at charred remains here, the story splinters into fragments that will never completely reunite. Different Soviet units file different reports. Some mention finding 2 bodies. Others report finding multiple charred corpses in the garden. One report describes a body with a gunshot wound to the head. Another mentions skulls crushed beyond recognition by artillery. The chaos of conquest creates chaos in documentation. The Red Army that captures Berlin consists of multiple divisions, multiple intelligence services, multiple chains of command that don't always communicate effectively. In the confusion, evidence gets collected by different units. Reports go to different headquarters. Nobody coordinates immediately to establish a single, coherent narrative of what was found and when. Within days, rumors spread through both Soviet and Western forces. Perhaps Hitler escaped in the confusion. Perhaps the bodies in the garden belonged to someone else, doubles. Stand-ins prepared for exactly this purpose. Perhaps the whole suicide story represents an elaborate deception, a final trick by a regime built on deception. The mystery doesn't emerge later through speculation by conspiracy theorists. It crystallizes in those first chaotic hours, formed from genuine uncertainty, from deliberate choices about what to reveal and what to conceal, from the simple fact that when you try to destroy evidence through fire, when you try to erase physical proof of existence, you create new mysteries in the ashes. Consider what this tells us about endings. In nature, death follows predictable patterns. Organisms die, their bodies return to the earth through decomposition, a process that erases individual form while redistributing matter into systems that continue. Humans have always struggled with this natural process, have sought to control what happens to remains, have developed elaborate rituals for managing the transition from life to death. Cremation represents one such ritual, returning the body to basic elements through fire rather than through gradual decay. But cremation requires specific conditions. Proper cremation facilities achieve temperatures above 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, maintain those temperatures for hours, ensure complete combustion. An improvised cremation in an open-air garden, using only gasoline as fuel, under artillery bombardment, conducted by guards who lack experience with such procedures, this cannot achieve what proper cremation achieves. The result becomes evidence itself. The incomplete destruction, the fragments that survive, the material that Soviet investigators discover, all of this tells a story. But the story proves harder to read than anyone anticipates. The fragments are genuine. The remains are real. But identifying them, establishing with certainty whose body lay in that garden crater, proving beyond all doubt what happened in those final hours, this becomes the work not of days, but of decades. The bunker itself, that concrete tomb, 30 feet beneath the garden, remains. Long after the last occupants flee, long after Soviet forces secure the site, long after the immediate chaos resolves into occupation, the bunker persists. It cannot be easily destroyed. 16-foot thick concrete walls resist conventional demolition. The structure that was built to preserve life proves equally resistant to erasure. In time, the bunker will be sealed, filled with rubble, buried beneath new construction. The site will become parking lots, memorial spaces, eventually apartments. Life will return to the surface. But beneath, in the darkness, the rooms remain. A monument to endings. A reminder that some spaces, once created, persist beyond their intended purpose. That history leaves marks not just in memory and in documents, but in physical structures that resist all our attempts to move beyond them. The mystery begins here in these concrete rooms, in this garden crater, in the gap between what witnesses claim they saw and what physical evidence proves. It begins with fire that burned but didn't completely consume, with testimony that agreed on basic facts but diverged on crucial details, with evidence collected in chaos and stored in secrecy. It begins, as all great mysteries begin, not with absence of information, but with information that proves frustratingly incomplete, tantalizingly close to certainty, yet forever shy of absolute proof. Tomorrow, we follow the investigators' Soviet intelligence officers who race to document the scene, who interrogate witnesses, who piece together the story from fragments of bone and fragments of testimony. We watch as the hunt for truth becomes entangled with political calculation, as evidence becomes leverage, as the question of Hitler's death transforms from historical inquiry into Cold War weapon. The story deepens, the mystery multiplies, and the search for certainty leads into ever more uncertain territory. But tonight, remember this. Beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, in a space where natural light never penetrates, in rooms built to preserve life in a world of death, history's strangest final act unfolded, a wedding in darkness, a suicide in silence, a cremation in chaos. And from these events, a mystery emerged that would persist not for months but for decades, not for years but for generations. The bunker's final days mark not an ending but a beginning, the start of a search for truth that continues even now, nearly 80 years later, still seeking certainty in the spaces between what we know and what we can prove. The hunt begins before the smoke clears, before the fires in Berlin's ruins cool to ash, before the last echoes of artillery fade into silence. Multiple Soviet intelligence units converge on the Reich Chancellery complex, not in coordination, but in competition. SMERSH, counterintelligence. NKVD secret police. Red Army intelligence. Each dispatches teams into the bunker's labyrinth. Each operates under different orders, different chains of command, different mandates about what they seek and what they should report. They are not merely investigating, they are competing to deliver Stalin the confirmation he demands. Consider what this means for truth. When multiple agencies with overlapping authority pursue the same evidence simultaneously, when political pressure demands rapid conclusions, when the stakes involve not just historical accuracy, but national prestige and strategic advantage under these conditions, what happens to careful investigation? What happens to the patient work of establishing facts? Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Klimenko leads the first systematic search on May 4, 1945. His team moves methodically through the bunker's rooms, photographing what they find, cataloguing documents, interrogating captured German personnel, discovered hiding in nearby buildings. They work with the discipline of trained investigators, yet they work under impossible pressure. Stalin wants answers. Moscow demands confirmation. The world watches or will watch. Information begins flowing from this sealed Soviet zone. In the garden crater, Klimenko's team discovers charred remains that resist immediate identification. The bodies, if they are bodies, if these fragments once constituted complete human forms, have been damaged by fire and further disturbed by artillery shells that continued falling even after the cremation. Klimenko's photographs, preserved in Soviet archives, show something that might be tissue, might be bone, blackened beyond easy recognition, mixed with debris in ways that make visual identification impossible. This is the fundamental problem that will haunt every subsequent investigation. The evidence exists. Material was recovered, but material damaged by fire, disturbed by explosions, collected in chaos, handled by multiple people, such evidence raises more questions than it answers. Is this Hitler's jawbone or someone else's? Does this skull fragment belong to the corpse described in witness testimony or to another body found in the same area? Without clear chains of custody, without careful documentation at the moment of discovery, these questions multiply endlessly. Soviet investigators locate members of Hitler's staff within hours. Vice Admiral Hans Erich Voss, found hiding in the bunker's deeper levels, provides the first detailed account of the suicide and cremation. His testimony seems straightforward enough. Hitler shot himself. Eva took poison. Guards burned the bodies in the garden. Simple facts, clearly stated. But when investigators press for details, inconsistencies emerge like cracks in ice. Voss didn't personally witness the bodies before cremation. He heard the gunshot, or believes he heard the gunshot, but cannot confirm what happened in the sealed room. He saw guards carrying something wrapped in blankets up the stairs, but couldn't see what the blankets contained. His testimony, like all testimony, represents reconstructed events filtered through stress, through loyalty, through the human tendency to fill gaps in direct observation with reasonable assumptions. This pattern repeats with every witness. Each person provides information. Each account contains elements of direct observation mixed with inference, mixed with second-hand reports, mixed with assumptions. When investigators attempt to synthesize these accounts into a single coherent narrative, the contradictions become apparent. Timing discrepancies, conflicting descriptions of who was present, divergent memories of how long the bodies burned, small differences that might represent simple confusion or might represent something more troubling. The search for Hitler's personal dentist, Hugo Blaschke, becomes urgent. Dental records offer the most reliable method of identification when bodies burn beyond visual recognition. Teeth survive cremation. Dental work fillings, bridges, distinctive patterns of repair and decay creates unique signatures resistant to fire and physical trauma. If investigators can match recovered dental remains to Hitler's known dental work, identification becomes virtually certain. But Blaschke fled Berlin before the final days. He's gone, disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse, location unknown. Soviet agents instead locate his assistant, Kethe Heusemann, who remained in the city. On May 11th, investigators bring Heusemann to examine the charred remains recovered from the garden. The identification scene unfolds in a makeshift morgue, probably a room in the Chancellery complex, probably lit by whatever electrical power Soviet generators provide, probably cold despite the May warmth outside, because Berlin in 1945 exists in a state of suspended animation between war and peace. Heusemann examines jawbone fragments recovered from the garden crater, and she recognizes what she sees. The dental work is distinctive. Hitler's bridges, specific fillings, the unusual configuration of his remaining natural teeth. Heusemann had personally assisted with this dental work during Hitler's treatments. She'd helped create the X-rays that documented these repairs. The fragments match her memory. They match the records. Her identification seems definitive. But this certainty contains a terrible irony that reveals everything about how the Soviet system operates. Heusemann's reward for providing confirmation involves immediate arrest. Stalin orders her imprisoned. She will remain in Soviet custody for 10 years, not because she committed crimes, not because she collaborated beyond her role as a dental assistant, but because her knowledge has become too sensitive to allow freedom. She knows what the remains look like. She can confirm identification. Therefore, she must be silenced. This decision tells us something profound about Stalin's intentions. If the goal were simply to establish truth, Heusemann would be protected as a valuable witness. Instead, she becomes a liability. Her imprisonment suggests that Stalin wants not clarity but control. Control over information. Control over when and how it's revealed. Control over what the world believes about Hitler's fate. Simultaneously, Soviet pathologists conduct secret autopsies on the remains. Forensic pathologist Faust Shkaravsky leads the first examination on May 8th. His report describes finding male and female corpses with evidence of cyanide poisoning glass ampule fragments in the mouths. The characteristic bitter almond scent in tissues that have absorbed the poison. The male body shows a gunshot wound to the head. The female body shows no gunshot damage but clear signs of cyanide. The findings match witness testimony. They support the suicide narrative. Yet the remains are so damaged by fire that many details remain ambiguous. Tissue has carbonized, transformed by heat into something resembling charcoal, cellular structure destroyed, organs shrunk and distorted beyond normal anatomical appearance. The pathologists work not with bodies but with fragments. They make determinations based on partial evidence, drawing conclusions that seem reasonable but cannot achieve absolute certainty. The Soviets conduct 4 more autopsies over subsequent weeks, 5 separate examinations of the same remains. Why? Because Stalin doesn't trust initial findings. Because different intelligence services demand independent verification. Because the political implications of conclusively confirming Hitler's death versus leaving the question open keep shifting based on Stalin's strategic calculations. Each autopsy reveals new details while creating new questions. One examination finds evidence that another misses. Descriptions vary slightly from report to report. Are these variations significant, suggesting genuine uncertainty about what the remains actually show? Or are they merely the normal inconsistencies that emerge when multiple pathologists examine damaged material under difficult conditions? The question matters, but answering it requires access to all reports, detailed comparison, careful analysis, work that won't happen for decades. Western intelligence agencies simultaneously pursue their own investigations, operating at a severe disadvantage. American and British forces didn't capture the bunker. They didn't secure the site. They must rely on escaped witnesses, on captured documents that made their way west, on reports filtering through from Soviet-controlled territory. The FBI receives reports of Hitler sightings within weeks in Spain, in Argentina, even in the United States. Each claim requires investigation, because the alternative, dismissing a report that proves accurate, carries unacceptable consequences. Hugh Trevor Roper, a British intelligence officer, receives assignment to investigate Hitler's fate in September 1945. He interviews available witnesses who made it to Western zones. He examines documents. He pieces together the most comprehensive Western account of the bunker's final days. His report, later published as The Last Days of Hitler, becomes definitive for English-speaking audiences, the standard reference, the accepted history. But Trevor Roper works without access to Soviet evidence, without the bodies, without the autopsy reports, without the crucial physical proof that might confirm or refute witness testimony. His conclusions rest entirely on testimony necessarily incomplete, potentially unreliable testimony from traumatized and compromised witnesses who have every reason to shape their accounts toward self-preservation. He does brilliant work with limited material, but brilliance cannot overcome fundamental evidentiary gaps. The contradictions in witness accounts grow more apparent as investigations continue and more survivors are interrogated. Hitler's valet Heinz Linge describes finding Hitler's body slumped forward on the sofa. Guard Rokas Misch remembers the body sitting upright. SS Adjutant Otto Gunsche claims he supervised the cremation personally, watching the entire process. Chauffeur Erich Kempke states he provided the gasoline and watched the burning from beginning to end. Yet their accounts of timing, of who was present, of how long the bodies burned, diverge in ways that cannot be reconciled through ordinary memory failure. These aren't minor discrepancies about peripheral details. These are fundamental disagreements about central facts. Linge says the bodies burned for 3 hours. Gunsche estimates 2.5 hours. Kempke claims closer to 4 hours, a 90-minute range in estimates. Which is correct? Were any of them actually timing the cremation, or are these reconstructed guesses made later when investigators demanded specific details? Did guards return multiple times to douse the remains with additional gasoline? Some witnesses remember this happening, going back to the bunker for more fuel, returning to the garden, pouring additional accelerant over the charring bodies. Others describe a single burning, one continuous cremation until fuel was exhausted, or Soviet shelling forced everyone back underground. These accounts cannot both be accurate. Most crucially, did anyone actually witness the bodies completely consumed by fire, or did Soviet shelling force everyone back into the bunker before cremation completed, leaving the final stage the crucial question of how completely the bodies burned unobserved? On this point, testimony fractures completely. Some witnesses imply they watched until nothing remained but ash. Others admit they retreated before the process finished. The difference matters enormously for understanding what Soviet investigators found 3 days later. The physical evidence presents equal complications. Investigators recover jawbone fragments, skull pieces with bullet holes, tissue samples, remnants of clothing, burned fabric that might have covered the bodies. But the chain of custody for these materials breaks down immediately. Different Soviet units collected different evidence at different times. Items got moved from garden to morgue to laboratory. They got relabeled, repackaged, sent to various facilities for examination. By mid-May 1945, nobody can definitively state which remains came from which location in the garden, whether the fragments all belong to the same 2 bodies, whether the skull with the bullet hole actually belonged to the male corpse identified through dental work, or whether these pieces, found in proximity, got associated without proof of connection. These uncertainties, born in the chaos of initial collection, will never be completely resolved. Stalin's motivation for concealing the truth gradually becomes apparent through his actions and statements. On May 26th, he tells Harry Hopkins during discussions related to the Potsdam Conference that Hitler likely escaped to Spain or Argentina. This statement directly contradicts his own intelligence service's conclusions. Stalin possesses the autopsy reports. He has Huysman's dental identification. He knows what his investigators found and what they concluded. Yet, he publicly promotes doubt. Why? Consider the advantages of uncertainty from Stalin's perspective. If Hitler might be alive, then Western governments must maintain vigilance. They must continue searching. They must wonder whether Nazi remnants might reorganize around their surviving leader. If Hitler escaped, perhaps with Western help, or at least through Western failure to secure escape routes, this becomes useful propaganda. If the truth remains ambiguous, Stalin controls the ultimate revelation. He holds cards that others don't know he possesses. The strategy reflects profound cynicism about truth's relationship to power. Facts exist. Evidence was collected. Conclusions were reached. But facts become tools. Evidence becomes leverage. Conclusions become secrets to be revealed or concealed based on strategic calculation rather than historical responsibility. Stalin transforms Hitler's death from historical event into political weapon. The mystery solidifies during summer 1945, not from lack of evidence, but from evidence withheld, from witnesses imprisoned, from deliberate political manipulation of information that should have been shared immediately. The physical facts of Hitler's death exist in Soviet files. The remains sit in sealed containers. The autopsy reports detail findings. But none of this becomes public. The world receives silence from the East and speculation from the West. Into this void, myths rush like water, filling a depression. If authorities won't confirm death definitively, perhaps death didn't occur. If evidence remains secret, perhaps evidence is weak. If witnesses are imprisoned rather than presented for testimony, perhaps their accounts would contradict official narratives. The absence of information doesn't create empty space. It creates space, filled with speculation, with rumor, with theories that grow more elaborate as time passes. Consider the natural parallel. In ecosystems, when a dominant species disappears, other species rush to fill the vacant niche. Nature abhors vacuum. The same principle applies to information ecosystems. When authoritative sources refuse to provide definitive answers, alternative explanations proliferate, not because evidence supports these alternatives, but because uncertainty creates opportunity for speculation to flourish unchecked. By summer's end, the question of Hitler's death has transformed from straightforward historical inquiry into something far more complex. A mystery wrapped in Cold War politics. A puzzle with pieces held by antagonistic powers who won't share information. A question that cannot be answered through normal historical methods, because normal methods require access to evidence, require ability to interview witnesses, require cooperation between investigators. None of these conditions exist. The evidence sits in Soviet archives. The witnesses remain in Soviet custody. Western investigators work with fragments of information, while Soviet investigators work under orders to conceal rather than reveal. The conditions guarantee that mystery will persist regardless of what actually happened in that bunker garden on April 30th, 1945. Tomorrow, we follow the search across continents, the FBI investigations, the Argentine leads, the submarine theories, the reported sightings from Colombia to Antarctica. We watch as the hunt for Hitler becomes a global phenomenon, as investigators pursue shadows across oceans, as the question transforms from "Did Hitler die?" into "Where did Hitler go?" The mystery multiplies, the theories proliferate, and somewhere in this expanding web of speculation, truth becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from wishful thinking, from deliberate deception, from the simple human tendency to believe that history's monsters cannot die ordinary deaths. But tonight, remember this. In the ruins of Berlin, in the chaos of conquest, in the immediate aftermath of history's most destructive war, evidence was collected and conclusions were reached. The work was done, the investigation was conducted, but political calculation determined that truth would be concealed rather than revealed, that uncertainty would serve power better than clarity. The mystery begins not with absent evidence, but with evidence deliberately withheld. And that choice, that decision to prioritize politics over historical transparency, creates consequences that persist for generations. The FBI opens file number 65-58805 on Hitler's suspected survival in summer 1945. Over the following 3 decades, this file will grow to contain over 700 pages, documenting reported sightings, investigated leads, pursued rumors spanning continents and decades. From 1945 through the 1970s, reports arrive with remarkable consistency. Someone claims to have seen Hitler in a remote location. Features roughly match. Details seem just specific enough to warrant investigation. The FBI investigates each claim seriously because the alternative carries unacceptable risk. Imagine dismissing a report as implausible, then learning years later it was accurate. Imagine the most wanted man in history living freely because investigators assumed death without proof. These possibilities compel serious investigation of even unlikely scenarios. Reports describe a submarine surfacing near the coast under cover of darkness, passengers disembarking covertly, transportation arranged to inland estates owned by German expatriates. The details seem plausible because they align with known facts. German U-boats did reach Argentina after Germany's surrender. U-530 officially arrived in July 1945, surrendering to Argentine authorities with its crew intact. If one submarine made the journey successfully, why not others? If some Nazi officers escaped via submarine, evading Allied naval patrols, navigating thousands of miles of ocean, reaching safe harbor in neutral Argentina if this happened once, provably, documentably, then why not multiple times? Why not with more important passengers? The logistics of submarine escape become subjects of serious analysis. A Type 9 German U-boat could travel 13,000 miles underwater with proper fuel conservation and favorable conditions. The distance from Germany to Argentina measures approximately 7,000 miles. The journey required approximately 60 to 70 days at cruising speed, longer if the submarine needed to evade detection, longer if weather conditions forced course alterations, longer if fuel efficiency demanded slower speeds. The timing aligns suspiciously well. Hitler disappears in late April. Submarines could depart in early May. 60 to 70 days later brings arrival to late June or early July, exactly when reports of mysterious submarine landings emerge from Argentine sources. Investigators map possible routes. North around Britain, avoiding the Channel's heavy patrols. West across the Atlantic, staying deep, surfacing only at night for air circulation and battery charging. South along South America's coast, approaching Argentina from the east where surveillance was lighter. The route was theoretically possible. The journey was demonstrably achievable. Other U-boats proved this. The question becomes not whether escape could occur, but whether it did occur. The Rat Line's escape networks that smuggled Nazi war criminals to South America demonstrably existed and functioned efficiently. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. Thousands of Nazis fled Europe through these organized routes after the war. The networks utilized legitimate infrastructure, exploited for illegitimate purposes. Red Cross travel documents issued to refugees whose true identities went unverified. Catholic Church assistance provided by clergy who believed they were helping persecuted Christians escape Soviet communism. Smuggling routes developed during wartime, now repurposed for peacetime evacuation. Adolf Eichmann reached Argentina via ratline in 1950, living openly under a thin alias until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Josef Mengele escaped to South America through similar channels, moving between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina for decades. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Leon, reached Bolivia with assistance from American intelligence, who valued his anti-communist credentials more than his war crimes. Walter Rauff, Eduard Roschmann, Aribert Heim, the list extends grimly through dozens of high-ranking Nazis who successfully vanished into South American sanctuary. If subordinate officers could escape detection and reach safety, the argument goes, surely the most wanted man in history commanded resources to achieve the same. Hitler possessed loyal followers willing to sacrifice everything for his survival. He had access to funds, gold, currency, assets hidden throughout occupied territories. He knew of escape plans, the rat lines were established before Germany's collapse, evacuation routes prepared for exactly this contingency. The premise requires only believing that Hitler would abandon his dramatic suicide plan in favor of pragmatic survival. Given his demonstrable fear of capture alive, his repeated statements that he would never allow the Soviets to parade him as a prisoner, perhaps escape represented not cowardice but strategy. Perhaps the suicide story itself was the cover, the deception that allowed the real escape to proceed unnoticed while investigators focused on burned bodies in a garden crater. Investigations focus particularly on German communities in Patagonia, Argentina's remote southern region. The area contained substantial German populations dating to 19th century immigration waves. German remained a common language in many towns. German customs, German architecture, German cultural practices persisted. A fugitive speaking only German could conceivably disappear into these communities, protected by ethnic solidarity, hidden by geography. Patagonia offered other advantages for someone seeking to vanish. The region is vast, hundreds of thousands of square miles of mountains, forests, grasslands, and coast. Population density was low in 1945. Infrastructure limited. Government presence minimal outside major towns. A person could purchase an isolated estancia, employ guards loyal through payment or ideology, live in comfortable seclusion, while the world assumed them dead thousands of miles away. The Analco House investigation exemplifies the pattern. In 1945, reports described a heavily guarded estate near Bariloche, Argentina. Guards spoke German. Visitors arrived by light aircraft rather than road. The property belonged to German nationals, but maintained unusual security measures, armed patrols, restricted access, behavior inconsistent with a simple farming operation or mountain retreat. FBI agents investigated. They interviewed neighbors, who confirmed the estate existed and German was spoken there but provided little else. Either they knew nothing more or chose to say nothing more. Agents examined photographs taken from a distance. The compound existed. Germans owned it. Security was tighter than normal, but proving Hitler resided there required more than circumstantial observation and suspicious behavior. It required definitive identification, which required closer access than investigators could obtain without diplomatic incidents between the United States and Argentina. Philip Citron's photograph surfaces in 1954, 9 years after Hitler's reported death. The image shows an older man bearing striking resemblance to Hitler, allegedly photographed in Colombia. Citron, a German expatriate living in South America, claims the man identified himself as Adolf Schrittelmayer, but was actually Hitler, living in Tunja, Colombia, protected by a small community of German loyalists. The CIA investigates extensively. Agents interview Citron multiple times, examining his story for consistency, for motivation to fabricate, for signs of delusion or deception. They analyzed the photograph for evidence of manipulation. This was 1954, before digital editing, so any forgery would require physical techniques that might leave detectable traces. They attempt to locate the compound Citron described, to identify other witnesses, to find any corroborating evidence. The investigation concludes the photograph shows someone who resembles Hitler but cannot be confirmed as Hitler. Facial features are similar, but similarity doesn't prove identity. Many older European men shared general characteristics. The photograph's quality limits detailed analysis. Citron seems sincere, but sincerity doesn't guarantee accuracy. He might genuinely believe he met Hitler while being mistaken. The file remains open, neither proven nor disproven, another thread in the expanding web of uncertainty. Antarctic theories emerged during the 1950s, fueled by documented German interest in the region. Nazi Germany conducted 2 Antarctic expeditions in 1938 and 39, mapping territories, establishing territorial claims, conducting research that combined scientific inquiry with strategic assessment. Official reports described these as geographic and scientific missions, but rumors suggested other purposes: secret base construction, hidden submarine facilities, preparations for scenarios where Reich leadership might need refuge beyond all possible pursuit. The theories seemed fantastical, yet contained grains of plausibility. Germany had submarine technology and expertise. Antarctica remained largely unexplored, unmapped except for coastal areas, unknown in its interior. If Hitler needed to disappear beyond all possible pursuit, if he required isolation so complete that even determined search efforts would fail, what location offered greater remoteness than the Antarctic interior? Rumors described submarine bases hidden in Antarctic ice caverns, naturally occurring caves in ice shelves, accessible from the sea, large enough to shelter vessels, temperature stable enough to support human occupation. The bases supposedly contained supplies, equipment, even small populations of German personnel who remained there after the war ended, waiting for orders that would never come, or maintaining facilities against the possibility of their leader's arrival. Operation High Jump, the massive U.S. Navy Antarctic expedition of 1946–47, becomes entangled in speculation. The operation deployed 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 personnel to Antarctica, the largest expedition in history to that point, dwarfing all previous Antarctic missions combined. Official objectives focused on establishing research bases, conducting scientific studies, and training personnel for cold weather operations. Legitimate objectives, all of them. Reasonable explanations for the expedition's scale and timing. But the timing, 1 year after Germany's defeat and the scale far larger than previous scientific expeditions, suggested other purposes to suspicious observers. Conspiracy theories proposed the expedition actually hunted Nazi bases, that the scientific cover story concealed a military operation to eliminate German holdouts before they could threaten Allied interests. The Navy consistently denied this, pointing to genuine scientific achievements and Cold War strategic interests in establishing American Antarctic presence. The truth, as often happens, probably lies between official explanation and conspiracy theory. The expedition served multiple purposes: scientific research, yes, but also military training, strategic positioning, and quite possibly investigation of reported German activity in the region. Not a full-scale military assault on hidden Nazi bases, but not purely innocent scientific research either. Something more nuanced, more complex, more aligned with how great powers actually operate when official and unofficial objectives intertwine. The sightings continue through the 1950s and 60s with remarkable persistence. Hitler allegedly appears in Colombia, in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Spain, in Austria. Witnesses describe an older man, increasingly frail as years pass, but bearing distinctive features that seem unmistakable. The moustache, though perhaps trimmed or removed, the hairstyle, though perhaps changed, the eyes, especially witnesses consistently mention the eyes, describing them as penetrating, intense, impossible to forget once you'd seen them. Each report receives investigation proportional to apparent credibility. Most prove mistaken identity, someone who resembles Hitler enough to trigger recognition in witnesses predisposed to see what they expect to see. Some reveal deliberate hoaxes, fabricated stories motivated by desire for attention, for payment from newspapers, for notoriety. Others remain unexplained witnesses who genuinely believe they encountered Hitler, whose sincerity seems beyond doubt, but who cannot provide definitive proof beyond their own conviction. The psychological dimension of the manhunt deserves examination because it reveals something profound about human nature and our relationship with evil. Why did people want Hitler to have survived? Partially because his death seemed insufficient. Hitler's crimes demanded punishment, trial, public accountability. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews. World War II killed over 70 million people globally. Hitler's responsibility for this catastrophe created powerful emotional demand for proportionate justice. Suicide in a bunker, quick, private, self-inflicted, denied the world its moral satisfaction. It allowed Hitler to escape justice on his own terms. If he survived, perhaps he faced years of fear, hiding in remote locations, knowing he'd lost everything, living with the knowledge that the world hunted him. Or perhaps he faced eventual capture and trial, forced to confront survivors, to hear testimony about atrocities committed in his name, to face judgment from the civilization he sought to destroy. Either outcome feels more fitting than quick death of his own choosing. This desire for proportionate justice created cognitive bias favoring survival theories. When witnesses encountered men resembling Hitler, they tended toward positive identification because they wanted it to be Hitler. When investigators found suggestive evidence, they weighted it more heavily than contradictory facts, because survival scenarios aligned with psychological need for continued accountability. The manhunt also reflected practical uncertainty that shouldn't be dismissed as mere conspiracy thinking. The Soviets refused to share evidence. They wouldn't confirm definitively what they'd found, how they'd identified it, what their experts concluded. Western governments possessed no bodies, no physical proof, no ability to verify Soviet claims. Official Soviet statements contradicted each other, sometimes claiming Hitler died, other times suggesting escape, creating deliberate ambiguity that served Stalin's strategic interests. Given this uncertainty from authoritative sources, investigating possible survival seemed reasonable rather than paranoid. Intelligence agencies couldn't afford to assume Hitler's death when doubt remained, when the possibility, however remote, existed that he might reorganize Nazi remnants, that he might become a rallying point for resistance, that he might return somehow to threaten the fragile peace being constructed on war's ruins. By the 1970s, active investigations wind down noticeably. The FBI file shows declining activity. Reports still arrive but receive less intensive follow-up. Resources shift to more current threats. Even if Hitler survived April 1945, he would be elderly by the 70s, 80 years old or older, unlikely to pose active threat, probably deceased from natural causes if he'd survived the war at all. The strategic importance of locating him diminishes with passing time. The manhunt gradually transitions from active pursuit to historical inquiry, from operational intelligence work to archival research. Yet this transition takes decades. The investigations remained active far longer than many people realize, far longer than seems reasonable, if authorities truly believed Hitler died in 1945. The investigation fundamentally changed how the mystery was perceived in public consciousness. Because serious intelligence agencies devoted substantial resources to investigating survival scenarios, those scenarios achieved legitimacy they might not otherwise possess. The theories weren't merely dismissed as crackpot ideas unworthy of attention. The FBI investigated. The CIA investigated. Military intelligence agencies investigated. This institutional validation created space for the mystery to persist, suggesting that perhaps, despite official histories, Hitler's fate remained genuinely uncertain. Consider what this tells us about certainty and doubt in historical knowledge. We trust authoritative sources, governments, intelligence agencies, expert historians to establish facts. When these sources investigate scenarios seriously, devoting resources and personnel to examination, their actions communicate that scenarios deserve serious consideration, even when investigations conclude negatively, finding no proof of survival. The fact that investigation occurred at all suggests the question was legitimate. The global manhunt, spanning continents and decades, transformed Hitler's death from simple historical fact into enduring mystery, not because evidence supported survival evidence consistently pointed toward death in the bunker, but because absence of definitive proof, combined with Soviet secrecy, combined with the psychological need for proportionate justice, combined with institutional validation through serious investigation, created conditions where mystery could flourish despite preponderance of evidence suggesting mundane truth. Tomorrow, we descend into Soviet archives, the sealed files, the hidden remains, the decades of deliberate concealment. We discover how political calculation transformed evidence into leverage, how witnesses were silenced, how truth became secondary to strategic advantage. The mystery deepens not through new discoveries, but through revelation of how systematically information was suppressed, how thoroughly evidence was concealed, how completely the Cold War corrupted historical inquiry. The story turns from what happened to why we couldn't know what happened, and that transformation reveals perhaps the darkest chapter of all. But tonight, remember this. Across the world, investigators pursued shadows based on hope more than evidence, on possibility more than probability. They searched because they needed to believe that history's greatest monster could not simply die and escape accountability. The manhunt reveals less about where Hitler went than about where humanity needed him to have gone, somewhere we could still find him, still bring him to justice, still impose the moral reckoning his suicide denied. The search was doomed from the beginning, but doom doesn't prevent searching. Sometimes we hunt not because we expect to find, but because the hunting itself serves purposes deeper than success. For 46 years, the physical evidence of Hitler's death remains locked in Soviet archives, inaccessible to Western investigators, hidden even from most Soviet citizens. The remains, fragments of jawbone, pieces of skull, tissue samples preserved in formaldehyde, move through a surreal journey of concealment, each relocation reflecting shifting political calculations about what revelation or continued secrecy serves Soviet interests at any given moment. Consider what it means to possess such evidence, to hold in your hands or in your archives, your laboratories, your secret facilities material that could resolve history's greatest manhunt with scientific certainty, to have the power to end speculation, to confirm death, to provide closure to a world desperate for answers, and to choose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to share that evidence, not to reveal what you know, not to let truth serve truth's own purposes, but instead to weaponize information, to deploy certainty and uncertainty strategically, to treat historical facts as instruments of policy. The original autopsy materials from May 1945 get stored in Smersh facilities in Soviet-occupied Germany. The evidence includes jaws with distinctive dental work that Kether Heusermann identified, skull fragments showing bullet damage consistent with self-inflicted gunshot wounds, charred tissue samples that retain enough cellular structure for pathological examination. Soviet forensic pathologists conduct 5 separate examinations between May and December 1945. 5 examinations. Not 1, not 2, but 5 independent assessments by different teams of experts. Each examination documented with photographs, with detailed written descriptions, with conclusions about identity and cause of death. Each team reaches similar conclusions. The remains show evidence of cyanide poisoning and gunshot trauma. Dental identification matches Hitler's records. The physical evidence supports the suicide narrative described by witnesses. But these reports become classified at the highest levels, accessible only to Stalin and select intelligence chiefs. The pathologist's professional work, conducted according to accepted forensic standards of the time, vanishes into secrecy. Knowledge exists, evidence exists, but neither knowledge nor evidence reaches beyond the tight circle of Soviet power. Stalin's Operation Myth begins in summer 1945. The operation's purpose, revealed decades later through archived documents, maintain deliberate ambiguity about Hitler's fate while using uncertainty as leverage against Western powers. Stalin orders continued public statements suggesting Hitler escaped, despite possessing conclusive evidence of death. Soviet propaganda alternates between claiming Hitler died and insinuating Western governments helped him flee, allowed escape routes to remain open, perhaps even actively assisted in evacuation. The contradictions aren't errors. They aren't confusion. They represent deliberate strategy. Keep the West guessing. Keep them searching. Use their uncertainty to suggest culpability. Deploy the mystery as diplomatic pressure and propaganda advantage. Truth becomes subordinate to tactics. Historical accuracy becomes secondary to strategic gain. The remains get moved to Moscow in 1945, stored in NKVD headquarters, relocated again in 1946 to a facility in Magdeburg, East Germany. Why move evidence repeatedly? Partially for security, preventing theft, destruction, or unauthorized access. Partially for political theater, demonstrating Soviet control over Hitler's ultimate fate. Each location becomes known to only a handful of officials. Even high-ranking Soviet leaders don't know where Hitler's remains actually rest. In nature, when animals cache food, they often create multiple storage sites, moving provisions to prevent total loss if one cache is discovered. The Soviet treatment of Hitler's remains follows similar logic: distribute knowledge, limit access, ensure that no single compromise can reveal everything. The strategy protects information while simultaneously making coherent understanding nearly impossible. Even within the Soviet system, fragmentation serves security. In 1970, the remains move again under circumstances that reveal how the evidence has transformed from asset to liability. The Soviet Union plans to relinquish the Magdeburg facility to East German authorities. Intelligence officers face a decision: transfer the remains to Moscow, adding another layer of concealment, or dispose of them permanently, eliminating the liability altogether. They choose destruction. On April 5, 1970, a small KGB team exhumes the remains from their Magdeburg burial site. The operation occurs in total secrecy, no witnesses beyond the team members, no documentation beyond classified reports, no fanfare or ceremony. Officers dig up containers holding fragments identified as Hitler and Eva Braun, along with remains attributed to Joseph and Magda Goebbels and their 6 children. Everything gets incinerated completely, not the improvised cremation of 1945, but thorough professional destruction using modern equipment. The ashes get crushed into powder. The powder scatters into the Biederitz River. According to official reports, nothing remains. No bones, no tissue, no physical evidence of the 20th century's most notorious figure. The evidence that survived the bunker garden cremation, that survived decades of storage and examination, that could have resolved the mystery definitively destroyed. Not by accident, not by neglect, but by deliberate decision that elimination served interests better than preservation. Yet the skull fragment and jawbone survive. These pieces, considered the most definitively identifiable evidence, get retained and transferred to Soviet archives in Moscow rather than destroyed with the other remains. Why? Perhaps because they represent the strongest proof, the evidence most resistant to challenge. The skull fragment shows a bullet's exit wound clearly. The jawbone contains distinctive dental work that Heusermann matched to records with professional certainty. These fragments represent insurance ultimate proof should the Soviet Union ever need to definitively end speculation. Or perhaps they survive for darker reasons. Perhaps Soviet authorities retained pieces while destroying the whole because even they recognized that complete destruction left no path back to certainty if circumstances changed. Perhaps they hedged, keeping options open, maintaining the ability to prove or cast doubt as future situations demanded. In either case, the selective preservation reveals the calculated nature of Soviet evidence management. The archive's opening in 1991, following the Soviet Union's collapse, creates jubilation among historians. Finally, after nearly half a century, Western researchers can examine Soviet evidence directly. Review autopsy reports that have been hidden for decades, photograph preserved remains, Access documents that might resolve lingering questions. The Russian Federal Archives releases materials, gradually autopsy reports in 1992, photographs in 1993, access to physical remains in 1995. Each revelation confirms basic facts while simultaneously exposing troubling aspects of Soviet investigation. Yes, Hitler died in the bunker. Yes, the body was burned. Yes, dental identification proved conclusive through professional methodology. These core facts withstand scrutiny, but the documents also reveal manipulation, witness suppression, deliberate concealment, systematic corruption of historical inquiry for political purposes. The autopsy reports describe finding cyanide in tissues, glass ampule fragments in mouths, bitter almond scent, characteristic of cyanide poisoning absorbed into tissue. But Hitler reportedly shot himself. Did he use both methods? Take cyanide, then shoot himself as redundant insurance? Or did Soviet pathologists find what they expected to find, unconsciously biasing observations toward conclusions matching witness testimony they'd already heard? The question matters because it reveals how expectation shapes perception even in supposedly objective scientific examination. When pathologists examine remains after hearing witnesses describe cyanide use, they look for cyanide evidence. They notice bitter almond scent because they're primed to detect it. They interpret ambiguous findings toward conclusions consistent with testimony. This doesn't mean their work was fraudulent, it means they were human, subject to the same cognitive biases that affect all human observation. The skull fragment's public display in 2000 creates renewed interest and immediate controversy. The fragment, stored carefully in archives, gets exhibited publicly, Russia revealing what it preserved, offering proof to the world. The skull shows clear bullet damage, a hole consistent with exit wound from gunshot to the head. Russian authorities present this as definitive proof. Here is Hitler's skull. Here is the bullet wound. The mystery ends. Except researchers immediately notice problems. The skull fragment seems smaller than expected for an adult male. The bone texture appears thinner, more delicate. The shape doesn't quite match photographic reconstructions of Hitler's head, based on known measurements and angles from documentary footage. These observations prompt requests for scientific testing, particularly DNA analysis, which could definitively confirm or refute the skull's identity through genetic evidence. Russian authorities initially resist testing, citing concerns about damaging irreplaceable historical artifacts. But the resistance fuels rather than dampens speculation. If officials possessed conclusive proof, why hesitate to verify it scientifically? If the skull definitively belonged to Hitler, DNA testing would confirm this and end all doubt. The reluctance suggests uncertainty that perhaps authorities themselves don't fully trust the evidence they preserved, that perhaps decades of storage and handling have created doubt even among custodians. The archives also reveal the extent of witness intimidation and systematic suppression. Ketha Heusermann, who provided the crucial dental identification in May 1945, spent 10 years in Soviet prisons after her testimony. 10 years. Not for Nazi collaboration, she'd committed no war crimes, held no party position, simply worked as a dental assistant. Her imprisonment reflected Stalin's determination that witnesses remain silent, that knowledge be controlled absolutely. Upon release in 1955, Soviet authorities forced Heusermann to sign documents prohibiting discussion of what she witnessed. She couldn't confirm publicly that she'd identified Hitler's remains, couldn't describe the dental work she'd seen, couldn't verify that the identification was conducted professionally and reached definitive conclusions. This enforced silence lasted until the 1970s, when political changes finally allowed her to speak. By then, decades had passed. The mystery had solidified. Her testimony, which should have ended speculation in 1945, arrived far too late to overcome the doubt that Soviet secrecy had cultivated. Other witnesses faced similar fates. Hitler's valet, Heinz Ling, spent 10 years in Soviet captivity. Guard Rokas Mish remained imprisoned until 1953. The pattern revealed systematic policy. Extract testimony, then silence witnesses indefinitely. This approach guaranteed Western investigators couldn't access first-hand accounts, couldn't verify Soviet claims, couldn't conduct independent evaluation of evidence. The Soviet Union maintained monopoly on both physical evidence and witness testimony. The archival documents expose how political calculations dominated every decision about evidence. Multiple memos show Stalin personally deciding what information to release, when to claim certainty versus uncertainty, how to use Hitler's fate as diplomatic leverage. The autopsy reports, while professionally conducted, served political masters first and historical truth second. Pathologists wrote conclusions knowing Stalin would read them, creating subtle but real pressures toward findings that matched desired narratives. Most disturbing, the archives reveal instances where evidence was potentially altered or selectively preserved. Photographs from the bunker garden in May 1945 don't perfectly match later photographs of excavated remains. Did different remains get photographed at different stages? Were materials consolidated from multiple sources? The chain of custody crucial for forensic validity in any modern investigation contains suspicious gaps, where evidence moved without complete documentation, where handling wasn't recorded, where the path from discovery to storage cannot be traced with certainty. The preserved jawbone provides the strongest evidence, ironically, because its identification occurred so early May 1945, before political manipulation reached full intensity. Husermann's identification happened within days of discovery, before complex bureaucratic machinery transformed evidence into political capital. The dental comparison relied on objective physical matching, bridges, fillings, tooth configurations that either matched X-rays or didn't, binary determination, not subjective interpretation. This identification withstands scrutiny because it occurred before anyone fully understood the evidence's ultimate importance, before political pressures could significantly influence conclusions, before the decision was made to conceal rather than reveal. The jawbone identification represents the one piece of evidence most resistant to doubt, not because it's handled better than other evidence, but because it was handled first, quickly, before the corruption process fully engaged. The Soviet archives opening ultimately revealed more about how Cold War politics shaped historical evidence than about Hitler's final moments. Yes, the documents confirmed Hitler died in the bunker, but they also demonstrated how profoundly truth becomes compromised when political interests control evidence absolutely. The mystery persisted not because evidence was absent, but because those possessing evidence chose concealment over revelation, silence over transparency, political advantage over historical clarity. Consider the broader implications. When authoritarian powers control information about events that matter to all humanity, when they treat historical truth as state property to be managed for strategic purposes, when they imprison witnesses and hide evidence and release information only when it serves their interests under these conditions, can historical truth ever be fully recovered? Or does the corruption become permanent, irrevocable, a wound to historical understanding that never completely heals? The Soviet archives opened, documents were released, evidence became accessible. Yet the mystery persisted because decades of concealment had created doubt so deep, so thoroughly embedded in consciousness, that revelation couldn't overcome it. The damage was done. The mystery had become permanent, not because evidence was insufficient, but because the handling of evidence had been so thoroughly corrupted that trust in any official account became impossible. Tomorrow, we enter the DNA laboratories, where modern science confronts historical mystery. We witness the moment when genetic testing promises to resolve decades of uncertainty. We watch as samples are extracted, analyzed, sequenced, and as results shatter, rather than confirm assumptions. The story moves from political manipulation to scientific revelation, from concealed archives to open laboratories. Yet, paradoxically, scientific certainty creates new uncertainty. Modern methods reveal how much we don't know, and the mystery deepens precisely when it should finally resolve. But tonight, remember this. Behind the Iron Curtain, evidence existed that could have ended speculation immediately. Professional forensic work was conducted, conclusions were reached. But political calculation determined that truth would remain concealed for half a century, that witnesses would be silenced, that the world would be denied access to evidence that belonged not to the Soviet Union but to all humanity. The Cold War corrupted many things, perhaps none more completely than the historical record of how World War II's central figure met his end. That corruption persists, the wounds remain. And even now, with archives open and documents released, we still struggle to recover truth from the wreckage of deliberate concealment. In September 2009, scientists make contact with Russian authorities, requesting permission to test the skull fragment attributed to Hitler. The research team, led by University of Connecticut archaeologist Nick Bellantoni, seeks to resolve the mystery through modern forensic techniques unavailable in 1945. DNA analysis can definitively identify remains where visual examination and dental records leave room for doubt. The skull fragment, with its characteristic bullet hole displayed for decades as proof of Hitler's death, represents the most direct physical evidence. Testing should provide conclusive answers. Consider what this moment represents. 64 years after Hitler's reported death, technology finally exists to confirm identity with near absolute certainty. DNA sequencing can determine gender, can establish family relationships, can identify individuals from cellular material, when every other method fails. The skull fragment sits in Russian archives, preserved, accessible to testing if authorities permit. The mystery that has persisted through generations might finally yield to scientific methodology that eliminates ambiguity, that transforms probability into certainty. Russian authorities grant limited access. The team cannot remove the skull fragment from archives. It's too historically significant, too valuable, too politically sensitive. But they may take small samples for analysis, bone fragments smaller than grains of rice. Enough material for DNA sequencing, but insufficient to damage the artifact significantly. Bellantoni extracts these tiny samples with surgical precision, conscious that he handles material that might rewrite history, that millions await these results, that this represents perhaps the only opportunity to test evidence that has remained concealed for generations. The samples travel to a Connecticut laboratory where molecular geneticist Linda Straussbaugh conducts analysis. The laboratory is modern, equipped with technology that would seem like magic to 1945 investigators. Yet the fundamental question remains unchanged. Whose skull is this? DNA testing examines two types of genetic material, each offering different information and different reliability. Nuclear DNA, inherited from both parents, provides unique individual identification, a genetic fingerprint that definitively identifies one person among billions. But nuclear DNA degrades over time, requires well-preserved samples, might not survive 60-plus years of storage despite careful handling. Mitochondrial DNA offers an alternative, inherited only through the maternal line, passed from mothers to children unchanged through generations. Mitochondrial DNA survives better in degraded samples. It provides less specific identification. It can determine gender definitively, can establish maternal lineage, but cannot distinguish between individuals who share maternal ancestors. For remains stored since 1945, mitochondrial DNA represents the most likely source of usable genetic information. The skull fragment, despite its age, should contain viable cellular material. Bone preserves DNA better than soft tissue. The storage conditions, while not perfect, were better than remains exposed to elements. The samples should yield at least mitochondrial DNA suitable for gender determination and possibly for comparison with Hitler's known relatives' genetic profiles. The laboratory process requires weeks of careful work. Technicians extract DNA from bone samples using chemical treatments that dissolve calcium while preserving genetic material, a delicate process where contamination or procedural error can invalidate results. Polymerase chain reaction amplifies the DNA, creating millions of copies from tiny original quantities. This amplification allows sequencing, but also amplifies any contamination, making purity essential. Sequencing machines read the genetic code letter by letter, base pair by base pair, building a complete picture of the genetic information preserved in the sample. The process is automated but requires human oversight, quality control at every stage, verification that results reflect genuine genetic material rather than contamination or technical artifacts. Finally, researchers compare sequences against reference samples to determine gender and potential family relationships. This comparison should answer the fundamental question: does this skull belong to Adolf Hitler? Gender alone provides crucial information. Hitler was male, so female DNA would definitively prove misidentification. The results shock everyone involved. The DNA extracted from the skull fragment comes from a female, not male, unambiguously, definitively female. The skull, long attributed to Hitler and displayed as proof of his death, belonged to a woman probably between 20 and 40 years old, at time of death. The revelation demolishes decades of assumed certainty in a single laboratory result. If the skull isn't Hitler's, whose is it? If Russian archives misidentified this crucial evidence preserved for 65 years, specifically because it was considered the most reliable proof what other certainties might be wrong, the questions multiply faster than answers can emerge. The immediate speculation focuses on Eva Braun. Perhaps the skull belonged to Hitler's wife, who died alongside him. This explanation preserves the basic narrative: both died in the bunker. Both bodies were burned. Soviet investigators collected fragments from both. A labeling error, while embarrassing to Russian authorities, wouldn't fundamentally alter historical conclusions about what happened. But this explanation faces significant problems. Soviet autopsy reports specifically described finding Hitler's skull, documenting the bullet wound in detail, as consistent with self-inflicted gunshot. Separate reports detailed finding Eva Braun's remains, noting cyanide poisoning but explicitly no bullet wound. The skull fragment's distinctive bullet hole matched descriptions attributed specifically to Hitler in original 1945 documentation. The Russian state archives issue defensive statements attempting to contain the revelation's implications. Officials note the skull fragment was never conclusively proven to be Hitler's acclaimed technically accurate but misleading, given how the fragment was catalogued, displayed, and discussed for decades. They suggest the evidence included multiple remains from the bunker area, that labeling errors might have occurred during chaotic collection in May 1945, that the skull fragment might come from another body found in the Chancellery complex. Perhaps a female staff member killed during the final battle. Perhaps a refugee seeking shelter in basement areas. Perhaps someone else entirely whose death coincided with Hitler's and whose remains got mixed with his during excavation and handling. These explanations protect the core narrative. Hitler died in the bunker while acknowledging that specific physical evidence was misidentified. But these explanations don't truly satisfy. The skull fragment wasn't random debris collected casually. Soviet archives specifically catalogued it as Hitler's skull, displayed it publicly as proof of death, preserved it for 65 years as historically significant evidence. The bullet hole gave the fragment special importance, physical proof of the gunshot wound described in witness testimonies, tangible evidence that suicide occurred as reported. Discovering the skull belonged to a woman undermines not just one piece of evidence but the entire Soviet investigation's credibility. If this fragment catalogued, displayed, preserved with such certainty was misidentified, what else might be wrong? The dental identification, the autopsy conclusions, the witness testimonies. The DNA revelation transforms specific error into systemic doubt. The finding forces reconsideration of all physical evidence. If the skull fragment is misidentified, can the jawbone be trusted? The dental identification in 1945 seemed conclusive. Heusermann matched dental work to Hitler's records with professional certainty. But subsequent handling raises questions. Soviet authorities moved the remains multiple times, stored them in various locations, conducted multiple examinations. Could fragments have become mixed during this process? Could contamination have occurred? Could labels have been switched? Researchers push for DNA testing of the jawbone as well. The preserved fragments, stored separately from the skull, should yield genetic material suitable for analysis. If jawbone DNA matches known Hitler relatives and Hitler's extended family includes living descendants who've provided DNA samples for comparison that would provide strong confirmation. If DNA sequencing proves impossible due to degradation, at least testing would establish limits of what science can definitively determine. Russian authorities resist additional testing, citing concerns about artifact preservation and cultural sensitivity of testing remains. But the resistance, coming after the skull revelation, feeds rather than dampens speculation. Why refuse testing if testing would confirm identification? Why protect artifacts from scientific examination if examination would validate the official narrative? The DNA controversy highlights fundamental challenges in applying modern science to historical evidence. In 1945, investigators possessed limited forensic capabilities. They relied on visual examination, dental comparison, witness testimony, basic pathology. These methods, while professionally conducted, lacked modern precision. DNA testing, radiocarbon dating, advanced toxicology, computer-aided reconstruction. These techniques transform what investigators can definitively establish. But they became available only decades after original evidence was collected, handled, stored, and in some cases destroyed. Chain of custody issues become critical under modern forensic standards. Contemporary science demands rigorous documentation: who handled evidence when, how samples were stored, what precautions prevented contamination. Every transfer gets logged, every examination gets documented, every deviation from protocol gets noted. These standards ensure reliability, enable verification, allow other scientists to assess whether conclusions are warranted. The Soviet investigation lacked these standards entirely. Multiple intelligence agencies collected materials without coordination. Evidence moved between facilities without consistent documentation. Storage conditions varied from facility to facility. Examinations occurred without standardized protocols. Any of these factors could compromise DNA analysis conducted decades later, introducing uncertainty that wouldn't exist if evidence had been properly preserved from the beginning. Gender determination from DNA isn't subtle science requiring interpretation. The presence of Y chromosomes definitively indicates male. The absence of Y chromosomes and presence of only X chromosomes definitively indicates female. The testing methodology is robust, well established, reliable across laboratories and techniques. The skull fragment tested unambiguously, female. This result cannot be explained through contamination or technical error. The skull belonged to a woman. Who was she? Among the many who died in the Chancellery during those final chaotic days, several possibilities exist. Female staff members remained in the bunker until the end, some dying during Soviet assault, some committing suicide, some killed in the crossfire of final battles. Women seeking shelter in basement areas died when Soviet forces cleared buildings room by room. Bodies in the garden burial area included not just Hitler and Braun, but Goebbels' family members Magda Goebbels and their 6 children, some daughters in the age range suggested by the skull. Perhaps Soviet investigators collecting skull fragments in May 1945 grabbed materials from multiple remains, later incorrectly attributing specific pieces to Hitler based on proximity, based on assumptions, based on desire to provide Stalin with definitive proof. Perhaps the labeling error occurred later, during one of multiple moves and examinations. Perhaps, and this seems increasingly possible, Soviet authorities themselves were never entirely certain which fragments belonged to which body, but claimed certainty because uncertainty was politically unacceptable. The DNA revelation also reframes the preservation narrative. Why did Soviet authorities save these particular fragments after destroying other remains in 1970? The standard explanation suggested they preserved the most reliably identified evidence while destroying questionable materials. But if they preserved the skull fragment as their most reliable proof, then discovering it doesn't belong to Hitler suggests they preserved the wrong evidence or preserved evidence they themselves doubted. Alternatively, if they preserved fragments despite uncertainty about identification, that explains resistance to scientific testing. They suspected testing might reveal problems, but couldn't admit doubt without undermining decades of official claims. Better to resist testing, to cite artifact preservation concerns, to maintain ambiguity than to invite scientific examination that might expose systematic misidentification. The controversy extends beyond Hitler specifically into broader questions about historical evidence and scientific methodology. The Romanov family remains, discovered in Russia in 1991, faced similar skepticism initially. Russian authorities hesitated before allowing scientific examination. Testing eventually confirmed the remains belonged to Tsar Nicholas II and family members, demonstrating how DNA analysis could resolve historical mysteries. The success story encouraged belief that science could answer all historical questions if only authorities permitted testing. The Hitler skull situation shows the opposite outcome, scientific testing undermining rather than confirming official identifications. The DNA results don't resolve the mystery, they deepen it. They demonstrate that what authorities claimed to know with certainty for 65 years was wrong. And if this was wrong, what else? Modern technology offers additional possibilities beyond basic DNA testing. Isotope analysis can determine where someone lived based on drinking water chemistry incorporated into bones and teeth during growth. Different regions have distinctive isotopic signatures that act like geographic fingerprints. Testing tooth enamel could establish whether the skull's owner lived in Germany or elsewhere, providing additional information about identity. Facial reconstruction from skull fragments can create visual approximations for comparison with photographs. Computer modeling combined with artistic skill can estimate appearance, suggest age, propose ethnic characteristics. These reconstructions aren't definitive but provide additional evidence for or against various identification theories. Advanced radiocarbon dating can establish time of death more precisely than earlier methods. While general time frame is clear, the skull dates from 1940s. Precise dating might distinguish between death in April 1945 versus earlier or later dates, potentially ruling out or supporting various scenarios. These techniques, applied to remaining evidence, might resolve uncertainties if Russian authorities permit testing and if evidence remains sufficiently preserved. But each test consumes material. Each analysis destroys part of the sample. This creates a preservationist's dilemma. Test now with current technology, potentially establishing facts but eliminating material for future analysis, or preserve samples for future testing with even better techniques but leave current questions unanswered. The dilemma has no perfect solution. Technology improves constantly. Methods available in 50 years might make current techniques seem crude, but waiting means another generation lives without answers. Testing means destroying irreplaceable evidence based on current limitations. The choice reflects broader tensions between present knowledge and future possibilities. The DNA revelation ultimately proves what it disproves. It conclusively demonstrates one thing. The skull fragment displayed for decades as Hitler's skull belonged to a woman. This negative finding matters profoundly because it shows how easily error persists when evidence isn't subjected to rigorous testing. For 65 years, that skull fragment stood as proof. Museums displayed it. Documentaries filmed it. Historians referenced it. The Soviet Union's collapse and archive opening seemed to finally provide physical confirmation accessible to Western verification. Then scientific testing, conducted with methodology unavailable in 1945, revealed the supposed proof was misidentified all along. The finding demonstrates that belief, even widespread official belief maintained for decades, doesn't constitute proof. That claimed certainty without scientific verification remains merely claimed. That historical evidence requires testing, not just cataloguing and display. The mystery paradoxically deepens through scientific advancement. Before DNA testing, investigators could reasonably trust dental identification, witness testimony, Soviet autopsy reports despite known uncertainties. The evidence wasn't perfect but seemed adequate for reasonable conclusions. After DNA testing revealed major misidentification, doubt extends backward, through all evidence. If the skull fragment is wrong, If Soviet authorities maintained false certainty for 65 years, what else might be wrong? Science was supposed to resolve the mystery, bring modern methods to historical questions. Replace speculation with genetic certainty. Instead, it demonstrated how much we don't definitively know, how deeply uncertainty runs, how profoundly even physical evidence preserved for decades can prove unreliable when finally subjected to rigorous testing. Tomorrow, we explore modern investigations using ground-penetrating radar, digital reconstruction, experimental archaeology. We watch as technology meets history in new ways, as researchers apply 21st century methods to 20th century mysteries. We discover how each technological advance reveals new information, while simultaneously exposing new limits to knowledge. The story moves from laboratories back to the garden crater, from genetic analysis back to geographical investigation, from molecular evidence back to physical sites. Yet everywhere, the pattern repeats. The closer we look, the more clearly we see how much remains uncertain. But tonight, remember this. In a Connecticut laboratory, genetic testing shattered 65 years of claimed certainty with a simple finding. Female DNA where male DNA should exist. The skull is not Hitler's, cannot be Hitler's. This negative proof stands absolute even as positive proof remains elusive. Science answered one question definitively, whose skull is this not? But the question we truly seek to answer, whose skull is it, remains as mysterious as ever. The revelation teaches that sometimes knowing what something isn't matters more than knowing what it is, that negative evidence can be more reliable than positive claims. That certainty about absence might be the only certainty history allows. Ground-penetrating radar units roll across the Reich Chancellery Garden site in 2014, scanning beneath layers of modern pavement and post-war construction. The technology sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground, measuring how these pulses reflect back from buried objects, voids, soil disturbances, anything underground that differs from surrounding material. The garden, where Hitler's body supposedly burned in April 1945, has been transformed completely. Built over, paved, converted into parking lots and memorial spaces. But underground, beneath human construction, traces might remain. The radar scans reveal a landscape of disturbances, multiple anomalies, countless areas where soil shows different density, different composition, different characteristics from surrounding earth. Each anomaly tells a story, or might tell a story, or could tell multiple stories that cannot be distinguished without excavation. Wartime bombing created craters throughout the area. Some were filled immediately, some remained for months before post-war reconstruction covered them. Post-war, construction dug foundations for new buildings, trenches for utility lines, pits for infrastructure. Soviet investigators excavated repeatedly between 1945 and 1970, searching for remains, recovering artifacts, removing evidence. Each disturbance leaves geological signatures compacted versus loose soil, different material compositions, voids where excavations were incompletely filled. Distinguishing the specific burial site, if any trace of it remains from countless other disturbances, requires analysis so sophisticated it verges on impossible. The radar shows anomalies, but which anomaly, if any, represents the cremation site? Which represents subsequent Soviet excavation? Which represents entirely unrelated construction? The technology reveals complexity without providing clarity. Digital forensics now reconstruct the bunker's layout with unprecedented precision. Historians combine original architectural plans preserved in archives, survivor, testimonies about room locations and corridor connections, Soviet photographs taken during initial investigation, and modern surveying techniques to create three-dimensional virtual models. These reconstructions place every room, every corridor, every stairwell with centimeter accuracy. Virtual walkthroughs allow researchers to test whether witness accounts of movement and timing seem physically plausible. Could someone carry bodies from Hitler's suite to the garden exit in the time witnesses described? The virtual model provides distances, stairwell dimensions, corridor widths. Researchers test scenarios. 2 people carrying a body, 4 people carrying 2 bodies, accounting for narrow stairs, tight corners, the physical difficulty of maneuvering deadweight through confined spaces. The analysis suggests witness timelines are physically possible but tight. No time for hesitation, no pauses for rest, direct movement from suite to garden, up specific stairwells, through specific corridors. The precision required suggests either witnesses remembered timing very accurately or remembered it incorrectly. The virtual reconstruction cannot distinguish between these possibilities. Do the supposed vantage points for viewing the cremation actually offer lines of sight to the burial area? The reconstruction models sight lines from bunker entrance to garden crater based on known elevations and obstructions. Yes, the cremation site would have been visible from certain positions, but those positions would also have been exposed to Soviet observation and artillery fire from positions 3 blocks away. This reveals a troubling inconsistency. Witnesses described burning the bodies in the garden while Soviet shells exploded nearby. The reconstruction shows the cremation site lay in direct view of Soviet artillery positions. Attempting cremation in the open, in daylight, under direct observation, and artillery fire seems extraordinarily dangerous, almost suicidal for the armed guards conducting the cremation. Yet witnesses insist this occurred. Multiple witnesses. Independent accounts that agree on this basic fact despite disagreeing on details. Do the contradictions between physical plausibility and consistent testimony suggest false testimony? Or did desperation override self-preservation in those final hours? Were the guards so committed to Hitler's final wishes that they accepted enormous risk? The virtual reconstruction poses these questions without answering them. Forensic analysis of the cremation itself advances through experimental archaeology, actually conducting controlled burns to understand what gasoline fires achieve under conditions similar to those described. Researchers work with university forensic departments, obtaining proper permissions and oversight for experiments that involve burning organic material as proxies for human remains. The experiments reveal uncomfortable facts that challenge accepted narratives, completely destroying. Human remains through open-air gasoline combustion requires sustained high temperatures over many hours. Bodies contain 60% water. Soft tissue burns, yes, but bones resist intensely. Bones require temperatures above 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for hours, to completely incinerate. Gasoline fires in open air reach peak temperatures of 1,400 degrees, but only briefly, only at the flame's heart, and temperatures drop rapidly as fuel exhausts. The fire must be continuously fed with fresh fuel to maintain intensity. Wind conditions matter enormously. Too much wind disperses heat and prevents sustained temperatures. Too little wind creates incomplete combustion that produces more smoke than heat. The experimental evidence suggests the improvised cremation, as described by witnesses, would produce partially burned remains, exactly what Soviet investigators reportedly discovered. Complete destruction would require either far more fuel than witnesses described hundreds of gallons rather than 40 or additional accelerants and controlled combustion conditions unavailable in the chaotic bunker garden under artillery bombardment. The partial burning doesn't disprove the suicide narrative. It actually supports witness testimony. On this point they described burning the bodies, not completely destroying them. The remains Soviet investigators found match what experimental archaeology predicts should result from the described cremation attempt. This correspondence between experiment and historical evidence strengthens the basic narrative, even while revealing why identification proved so difficult. Advanced photographic analysis applies modern digital enhancement to historical images. Photographs from May 1945 show Soviet investigators examining the garden site, examining remains, cataloguing evidence. Original prints, preserved in archives, were taken with 1940s technology-limited resolution, grainy quality, poor tonal range. Digital enhancement brings out details invisible in original prints. Facial features on bodies become more distinct. Specific damage patterns emerge from general darkness. Background objects, previously indistinct, resolve into recognizable forms. These enhanced images sometimes support and sometimes contradict written reports. One photograph appears to show remains in the garden crater. Enhanced analysis reveals these could be from initial discovery or from subsequent excavations, days or weeks later, impossible to determine from the image alone, which means dating and identification remain problematic. Genealogical research tracks down descendants of bunker survivors for DNA comparison. Hitler had no direct descendants, no children, no grandchildren. But extended family survived, distant cousins, relatives of relatives, people who share common ancestors with Hitler through his father's or mother's lines. If any preserved tissue samples exist with questionable attribution to Hitler, comparison with relatives' DNA could establish family relationships. Several living individuals descended from Hitler's extended family agreed to provide DNA samples for potential comparison. The cooperation is remarkable. These individuals bear no responsibility for Hitler's actions but live with the weight of family connection. Their willingness to assist scientific investigation demonstrates how the mystery affects even those only tangentially connected. But Russian authorities must provide access to preserved remains for comparison to occur. The cooperation required between nations, between families, between scientific institutions proves challenging. Diplomatic sensitivities, cultural concerns, bureaucratic inertia all create barriers to research that should be straightforward if historical truth were the only consideration. Declassified intelligence documents from multiple nations add pieces to the puzzle. American files from 19EP2, 45 and 46 reveal what Western intelligence knew and when. CIA documents from the 1950s show investigation methodologies, source reliability assessments, conclusions reached about escape theories. British intelligence reports detail interrogations of captured German officers, showing which testimonies seemed credible and which raised doubts. Each nation's files provide different perspectives, different priorities, different information. The complete picture was always fragmented across multiple archives, never fully assembled in one location. Even now, with many documents declassified and available, some materials remain sealed. Some files were destroyed decades ago. Some information was never documented, existing only as verbal communication or operational knowledge that died with participants. The documents expose how quickly the mystery became political rather than purely historical. Within months of Germany's surrender, competing narratives emerged, serving different national interests. Soviet accounts promoted uncertainty to maintain leverage against the West. Western intelligence selectively credited escape theories to justify continued vigilance and intelligence operations. German survivors told stories influenced by loyalty, fear of prosecution, and desire for self-preservation. No single actor possessed complete objectivity. Every account served purposes beyond pure historical accuracy. This doesn't mean everyone lied, it means truth became filtered through political, personal, and institutional lenses that shaped information in ways participants might not even consciously recognize. Modern psychological profiling applies to the central question: would Hitler choose suicide or escape? Psychologists analyze Hitler's documented statements throughout his life, his demonstrated fear of capture and humiliation, his theatrical personality that demanded controlling how others perceived him, his need to control his image and death rather than allowing enemies to control it. The analysis suggests suicide fits his psychological profile remarkably well. Hitler obsessed over narrative control. He understood propaganda, understood how images and stories shaped perception. Multiple witnesses recall him stating repeatedly that he would never allow enemies to parade him as a prisoner, would never face trial, would never give the world satisfaction of his humiliation. This documented fear suggests suicide represented staying in character rather than cowardly abandonment of principles. Hitler lived theatrically. He died theatrically. The suicide fits the pattern of his entire life controlling the story, determining the ending, exiting on his own terms rather than allowing others to impose their endings upon him. But psychological profiling also reveals Hitler's documented capacity for self-deception and rationalization. Throughout his life, Hitler abandoned positions when they became untenable while claiming strategic withdrawal. He broke promises while justifying necessity. He preached sacrifice while living comfortably in protected headquarters. If the bunker situation became hopeless, might he rationalize escape as strategic withdrawal rather than cowardly flight? The psychological evidence proves ambiguous. Both suicide and escape could be made consistent with his personality depending on which aspects of character are emphasized. This ambiguity demonstrates that psychology alone cannot resolve historical questions. It provides context, suggests plausibility, helps understand motivations, but cannot determine with certainty what someone chose in a specific moment under extreme pressure. Facial recognition technology gets applied to photographs of aged men resembling Hitler from the 1950s and 60s. The technology measures facial proportions, bone structure, underlying visible features, distinctive characteristics that remain consistent despite aging. Several photographs showing elderly men in South America get analyzed systematically. The technology determines whether facial proportions match Hitler's within statistical confidence levels. None of the analyzed photographs show matches above threshold for positive identification. Most show general similarities explainable through resemblance. Many elderly European men of that generation shared certain features. A few remain ambiguous, with proportions close enough that degraded photograph quality prevents definitive conclusions either way. The analysis demonstrates that resemblance, even striking resemblance, doesn't constitute identification. Human perception tends toward recognition when expecting to see something. Show people photographs of men who vaguely resemble Hitler. Tell them Hitler might have survived, and they'll tend toward positive identification. Objective measurement reveals most supposed sightings show general similarity rather than specific identity. The search for buried evidence continues, but in limited ways. Ground-penetrating radar identifies potential sites worthy of excavation, but excavation requires navigating complex German historical preservation law. World War II sites are protected as historical monuments. Disturbing them requires extensive permissions, archaeological supervision, historical review. The law serves important purposes, preventing treasure hunters from destroying historical sites, ensuring any excavation is conducted professionally, but also makes investigation difficult. When excavation occurs under proper supervision, archaeologists find artifacts, buttons from uniforms, shell casings from ammunition, structural debris from demolished buildings, material culture of war and collapse. But nothing definitively linked to Hitler's death. Nothing that couldn't have come from any of thousands of people who died in that area during those chaotic days. The garden has been too disturbed, too many times, by too many actors with different purposes, for untouched primary evidence to remain easily accessible. Toxicology advances allow new analysis of preserved tissue samples, if samples exist, and authorities permit testing. Modern techniques detect cyanide compounds in concentrations lower than 1940s technology could measure. This matters because autopsy reports described finding cyanide evidence in tissues. Enhanced testing of the same samples could confirm or refute those findings with greater precision, but accessing samples requires Russian cooperation, and concerns about consuming irreplaceable material in testing limits what researchers can attempt. Each test destroys part of the sample. Each analysis eliminates material for future examination. The trade-off between current knowledge and future possibilities creates difficult choices with no obviously correct answers. The application of modern intelligence analysis techniques to historical evidence reveals patterns invisible to original investigators. Social network analysis maps relationships among bunker inhabitants, showing who knew what and when. Timeline analysis correlates testimonies to identify consistent versus contradictory elements. Probability modeling calculates likelihood of various scenarios given documented constraints. These analytical approaches don't produce definitive answers. They narrow the range of plausible scenarios, highlight inconsistencies requiring explanation, identify which witness testimonies seem most reliable based on internal consistency and external corroboration. The work is valuable but limited. No amount of statistical analysis can overcome fundamental evidentiary gaps. One modern analysis focuses specifically on escape logistics. Could Hitler have actually fled the bunker and Berlin in those final chaotic days? The analysis considers multiple factors systematically. Berlin was completely surrounded by Soviet forces, no gaps in the encirclement, no routes out without passing through Soviet lines. The bunker had limited exits, all known to Soviet intelligence, all under observation. Hitler was physically unwell, Parkinson's disease, possible other conditions, certainly not in condition for demanding physical escape. He was immediately recognizable, perhaps the most recognized face in the world at that time, impossible to disguise convincingly. Moving through Soviet-occupied territory required transportation, documents, assistance networks, all while evading capture by forces specifically seeking him. The logistics analysis concludes that successful escape, while not physically impossible, required extraordinary luck and preparation. Every factor worked against success. The more conditions are examined, the more improbable escape seems not impossible in the sense that physical laws prevent it, but extraordinarily unlikely given documented circumstances. Yet the same analysis reveals that several other high-ranking Nazis did successfully escape the bunker and Berlin in those final days. Martin Bormann fled, reaching Soviet lines before his ultimate fate. Multiple bunker inhabitants escaped through subway tunnels, making their way to Western lines or disappearing into civilian populations. If subordinates could escape, why not Hitler? The answer seems to be that successful escapees were younger, healthier, less recognizable, and willing to risk capture for the chance at freedom. They could blend into refugee streams, could pose as ordinary soldiers or civilians, could adapt to changing circumstances. Hitler lacked these advantages, but this reasoning rests on assumptions about Hitler's thinking and decision-making at a moment of extreme stress, assumptions that might be reasonable but cannot be proven. Modern investigations ultimately demonstrate how technology expands investigative possibilities, while simultaneously revealing investigative limits. Ground-penetrating radar finds anomalies but cannot date them or confirm significance. Digital reconstruction creates precise models but cannot verify whether witness testimonies accurately describe actual events. DNA testing definitively identifies gender but requires samples Russian authorities may not provide. Each technological advance answers some questions while revealing how many questions remain unanswerable with currently available evidence and access. The tools improve, the methods become more sophisticated, the analysis becomes more rigorous. Yet the fundamental mystery persists because mystery doesn't arise from technological limitation, but from evidence destruction, from political concealment, from choices made in 1945 that cannot be undone by any amount of modern capability. Tomorrow, we contemplate why this mystery endures when countless other historical questions have been resolved or forgotten. We explore what the persistence reveals about human nature, about our relationship with history's darkest chapters, about the need for certainty that exceeds our ability to achieve it. We discover how mystery itself serves purposes, psychological, cultural, existential, that transcend simple curiosity about past events. The story moves from investigation to contemplation, from seeking answers to understanding why answers might not exist, from pursuing truth to accepting that some truths lie forever beyond reach. But tonight, remember this. Modern technology offers remarkable tools for historical investigation. We can scan underground without excavating. We can reconstruct spaces digitally with precision impossible in physical models. We can test DNA from samples smaller than rice grains. We can analyze photographs, model probabilities, correlate testimonies through computational methods our ancestors couldn't imagine. Yet all this capability, all this technological sophistication, cannot overcome evidence, deliberately destroyed, systematically concealed, fundamentally compromised by choices made when the evidence was fresh and technology was primitive. The tools improve, but the material they work with remains forever limited by decisions made 79 years ago. That limitation defines the mystery more than any technological constraint. In 2024, 79 years after Hitler's reported death, new books still investigate the mystery. Documentaries still explore contradictory evidence. Online forums still debate survival theories with intensity that suggests personal stakes in outcomes determined long before participants were born. The persistence reveals something profound about how certain historical events resist closure despite overwhelming evidence, despite overwhelming time elapsed, despite every rational reason to accept probability and move forward. Why does this particular mystery endure when countless other historical questions have been definitively resolved or forgotten entirely? The mystery endures partially because destruction of evidence was so thorough, so systematic, so complete that evidentiary gaps can never be filled. If Hitler intended to eliminate proof of his death, whether through elaborate escape requiring evidence destruction as cover, or simply to deny enemies the satisfaction of his corpse, he succeeded remarkably. The improvised cremation with gasoline created the first layer of destruction. The hasty burial in a shallow crater exposed remains to artillery bombardment that caused additional damage. The continued Soviet shelling of the site for days after burial further disturbed evidence. Then Soviet investigators excavated multiple times, moving remains, handling materials without modern forensic protocols, storing evidence in varying conditions. Finally, in 1970, Soviet authorities deliberately destroyed most remaining physical evidence, scattering ashes into a river, eliminating the material that might have conclusively answered questions. These successive layers of destruction, accidental, circumstantial, and deliberate, created evidentiary gaps that can never be completely filled regardless of technological advancement. The Soviet decision to conceal evidence for nearly half a century transformed simple evidentiary gaps into deliberate mystery. Had Soviet authorities in 1945 immediately shared autopsy findings, provided access to remains, allowed Western verification, coordinated internationally to establish facts, the mystery might have ended quickly. Yes, some would have doubted. Yes, conspiracy theories would have emerged. But official cooperation would have denied those theories the oxygen of institutional secrecy. Instead, Stalin chose secrecy, contradiction, and strategic manipulation. This deliberate obfuscation gave survival theories half a century to develop, spread, and become culturally embedded. By the time archives opened in the 1990s, the mystery had achieved independent existence in popular consciousness. It had become self-sustaining, feeding on itself, generating new questions faster than old ones could be answered. The mystery reflects psychological need as much as evidentiary uncertainty. Hitler's crimes were so enormous that his simple death seems inadequate to the magnitude of evil he represented. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews through systematic, industrial extermination. World War II killed over 70 million people globally through combat, bombing, starvation, disease, genocide. Hitler's responsibility for this catastrophe creates powerful emotional demand for proportionate justice. Suicide in a bunker, quick, private, self-inflicted, denies the world its moral satisfaction. It allows Hitler to escape justice on his own terms. No trial, no confrontation with survivors, no forced witnessing of testimony about atrocities committed in his name, no public accounting, no opportunity for the world to impose judgment upon the judged. If Hitler survived, perhaps he faced years of fear, hiding in remote locations, knowing he'd lost everything, living with knowledge that the world hunted him. This seems more fitting prolonged suffering rather than quick exit, or perhaps he faced eventual capture and trial, forced finally to face consequences, to answer for crimes, to experience the powerlessness he imposed on millions. Either outcome feels more appropriate than death of his own choosing at a time of his selection. This desire for proportionate justice creates cognitive bias, favoring survival theories. The need for fitting punishment makes people want to believe Hitler lived beyond 1945, makes them weight evidence toward survival, makes them interpret ambiguity as possibility. The bias isn't conscious necessarily, isn't deliberate choosing to believe what one wants to believe, but operates at deeper psychological levels, where narrative satisfaction influences evidence evaluation. The mystery also endures because it raises profound questions about historical knowledge itself. How do we know anything about the past? We rely on testimony from witnesses who might misremember, might lie, might reconstruct events rather than recall them. We trust documentation that can be forged, can be mistaken, can be created for purposes other than accurate historical record. We examine physical evidence that deteriorates, gets mishandled, becomes separated from context that gives it meaning. The Hitler mystery exposes every weakness in how we construct historical truth. If we cannot definitively prove the death of the 20th century's most documented figure, despite multiple investigations spanning decades, despite modern technology unavailable to original investigators, despite access to archives once sealed, if certainty eludes us here, what else do we think we know but actually don't? The question unsettles. We want to believe historical knowledge is solid, that past events can be established with confidence, that truth persists despite time and decay. The Hitler mystery suggests otherwise. It suggests that some past events become fundamentally unknowable when evidence is destroyed, when witnesses die, when political considerations override historical responsibility. If this mystery remains unsolved, how many other supposed facts rest on foundations less solid than we imagine? Each generation rediscovers the mystery through contemporary concerns, finding in it reflections of current anxieties. In the immediate post-war years, the mystery reflected genuine uncertainty and Cold War tensions. Nobody knew what Soviets had found, what they were concealing, whether official accounts could be trusted. In the 1960s and 70s, it connected to broader questioning of official narratives, to distrust of government secrecy, to belief that authorities routinely concealed truth from citizens. In recent decades, the mystery resonates with widespread institutional distrust, with skepticism toward received truths, with belief that official stories often mask more complex realities. The mystery shapeshifts across generations, adapting to each era's particular anxieties while maintaining its essential character. This adaptability explains partial persistence. The mystery means different things to different times while remaining fundamentally the same question. The mystery demonstrates how absence of evidence differs from evidence of absence, a philosophical distinction with practical implications. We lack definitive proof of Hitler's death. Soviet evidence was compromised through concealment, mishandling, and partial destruction. Witnesses provided contradictory testimonies. Physical remains were destroyed or prove unreliable under modern testing. We lack positive proof that death occurred as described. But we also lack evidence of survival. No confirmed sightings withstand scrutiny. No documentary evidence proves escape. No credible testimony establishes Hitler living beyond April 1945. No physical evidence, photographs, possessions, remains, has emerged despite decades of searching. We lack positive evidence for survival as much as for death. We face not positive evidence for either scenario, but negative absence of conclusive evidence for both. In this void between evidenced claims, psychological predisposition determines belief more than rational evaluation. Those needing Hitler dead for psychological closure accept probability as proof. Those needing him alive for prolonged justice embrace possibility as evidence. Neither position rests on conclusive proof, because conclusive proof doesn't exist. Technology's failure to resolve the mystery proves particularly striking and instructive. DNA testing was supposed to end speculation by providing genetic certainty impossible with earlier methods. Instead, it revealed that supposed proof the skull fragment displayed for decades was misidentified, adding new uncertainty rather than establishing old facts. Archives openings should have provided answers by making concealed evidence accessible. Instead, openings exposed the extent of Soviet manipulation, demonstrating how thoroughly political considerations corrupted historical inquiry. Each advance that promised resolution instead revealed new layers of uncertainty. Modern investigators possess tools unavailable to original researchers: ground-penetrating radar, DNA sequencing, digital reconstruction, advanced photographic analysis. Yet the essential mystery persists, suggesting that some historical events become unknowable, not from technological limitation, but from fundamental evidentiary destruction. that no amount of modern capability can overcome. The comparison with other historical mysteries proves instructive by highlighting what makes this case unique. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown despite extensive investigation. But this mystery doesn't involve institutional concealment, just insufficient evidence from Victorian era London, where forensic science was primitive and documentation incomplete. The fate of Amelia Earhart puzzles investigators, but this represents genuine disappearance over ocean, a case where absence of evidence results from circumstances rather than deliberate destruction. The Hitler mystery differs because we had evidence. We had witnesses present at the time. We had access to the location immediately after events occurred. We had remains collected and examined professionally. We had dental identification conducted by qualified experts. We had everything necessary for definitive conclusions. Yet systematic concealment by Soviet authorities, combined with deliberate evidence destruction, transformed these advantages into additional sources of uncertainty. The probability calculation appears straightforward to anyone approaching the question rationally. Nazi Germany suffered total collapse. Berlin was completely surrounded with no gaps in Soviet encirclement. Hitler was physically unwell and immediately recognizable. The bunker had limited exits, all known to Soviet intelligence. Witnesses described suicide and cremation. Dental identification matched records. Autopsy reports, despite flaws, supported the narrative. Against this, survival requires accepting that Hitler escaped through Soviet lines, evaded detection despite being the most wanted man on Earth, maintained perfect operational security despite needing assistance from dozens of potential accomplices, left no documentary evidence despite decades of searching, and died without any witness coming forward. The scenario requires accepting multiple compounded improbabilities. Death in the bunker represents the most likely scenario by overwhelming margin. Yet the mystery persists because probability doesn't eliminate possibility. A 1% chance of survival still permits survival. Absence of evidence might reflect successful concealment rather than non-occurrence. The human mind gravitates toward ARSAs, exceptional narratives rather than probable mundane ones. A dramatic escape fascinates more than routine death, regardless of relative likelihood. The mystery's persistence reveals humanity's relationship with its darkest chapters. We cannot simply forget Hitler or relegate him to settled history. His shadow extends across generations. Each new generation encounters the Holocaust, confronts evil's magnitude, and seeks understanding that forever eludes complete comprehension. The question of Hitler's death becomes proxy for larger questions about evil, justice, accountability, and whether history provides satisfactory endings to its darkest stories. The comparative analysis with other Nazi leaders proves revealing. We know Joseph Goebbels died in the bunker, his body was identified, and no survival theories persist. We know Hermann Göring survived to face trial at Nuremberg before committing suicide. We know Heinrich Himmler died captured by British forces. We know Martin Bormann likely died escaping Berlin, his remains later identified through DNA testing. We know Josef Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, and others survived through rat lines before eventual capture or natural death. The fates of Hitler's subordinates are generally established without persistent mystery. Only Hitler's death remains perpetually questioned across generations. This unique status suggests the mystery serves specific cultural functions beyond simple historical curiosity. Hitler represents absolute evil in modern consciousness. His fate must remain special, distinct from ordinary deaths of subordinates. The uncertainty preserves Hitler's exceptional status not through glorification, but through continued relevance, through refusal to let him rest comfortably even in death. The ethical dimensions deserve careful consideration. Does perpetuating the mystery dishonor victims by suggesting their tormentor might have escaped justice? Some Holocaust survivors and their descendants wanted definitive proof of death closure, certainty, confirmed justice. The uncertainty troubles them, denies satisfaction, leaves open possibilities that should be closed. Or does the mystery honor victims by refusing simple historical closure, by maintaining vigilance against evil's return, by ensuring Hitler remains perpetually questioned rather than historically settled. Others find the uncertainty appropriate. Hitler should not rest easily even in death, should remain historically uncomfortable, should be forever subject to investigation and doubt. The perspectives divide thoughtfully, both reflecting legitimate responses to unimaginable trauma. The practical question remains: what would constitute sufficient proof to end the mystery? If Russian archives provided complete chain of custody documentation, if multiple tissue samples became available for DNA testing, if comparison with verified Hitler relatives' DNA proved conclusive matches, if independent laboratories confirmed findings, if international consensus emerged from transparent process, would the mystery end? Probably not entirely. Questions would shift to DNA testing methodology, to sample authenticity, to potential conspiracy to provide false evidence. The mystery has achieved such cultural embedding that definitive proof might be rejected as itself suspicious, too convenient, too complete, therefore probably fabricated. This represents perhaps the darkest aspect of persistent mystery. After certain thresholds, evidence no longer convinces, proof becomes suspect, and certainty itself seems implausible. The final consideration involves historical responsibility and honest acknowledgement of limits. Professional historians largely agree Hitler died in the bunker based on preponderance of evidence. Witness testimonies, despite inconsistencies, converge on basic facts. Dental identification was conducted professionally. Soviet concealment reflected political calculation rather than evidentiary. Absence. The balance of evidence supports the standard account decisively, but historians also acknowledge evidentiary gaps that cannot be filled. Soviet manipulation that corrupted investigation, and destroyed evidence that prevents absolute certainty. Responsible scholarship must distinguish between probable historical truth and absolute certainty. The distinction matters. Claiming certainty without acknowledging limitations undermines credibility. Acknowledging limitations while maintaining probable conclusions reflects honest engagement with evidence's reality. The mystery endures because it demonstrates historical knowledge's conditional nature. We construct understanding from imperfect evidence, from biased witnesses, from incomplete documentation, from degraded physical remains. We make judgments about probability, while acknowledging uncertainty. We balance reasonable conclusions against alternative possibilities that cannot be completely eliminated. We accept that knowledge differs from certainty, that confidence differs from proof, that responsible conclusions acknowledge their own limitations. The Hitler mystery sits at the extreme end of this spectrum: enough evidence to support probable conclusions, enough uncertainty to prevent absolute certainty, enough cultural significance to ensure continued investigation, regardless of diminishing returns. The mystery succeeds not because it reflects genuine equipoise between competing scenarios, but because it reflects humanity's relationship with its own history, particularly its darkest chapters. We want certainty about our darkest moments. We demand clear accountability for supreme evil. We need to know that history's monsters face justice and that truth prevails over deception. When evidence proves insufficient to provide this certainty, whether through deliberate destruction, systematic concealment, or simple evidentiary limitation, we face uncomfortable truth about historical knowledge itself. Some things we can never definitively know. Some mysteries persist despite investigation, despite technology, despite time. Some questions remain forever open, calling to each generation to examine evidence, consider possibilities, and confront uncertainty. The Hitler mystery demonstrates that history itself contains enigmas as impenetrable as any ancient riddle, that modern methods cannot always recover what time and intention conceal. Perhaps the mystery endures because it should endure, because easy certainty about Hitler's death would allow comfortable closure, would let us file this chapter under resolved and move forward without lingering discomfort. The persistent uncertainty prevents this comfort. It keeps us questioning, investigating, refusing to simply accept official narratives. It maintains active engagement with history rather than passive acceptance. In this view, the mystery serves purposes beyond solving. It keeps alive questions about how we know what we know, about whether authority deserves trust, about how evidence can be corrupted when political power controls historical inquiry. These questions transcend Hitler specifically. They apply to all historical events, all official narratives, all supposedly settled facts. The Hitler mystery, by remaining unsettled, reminds us that skepticism toward official accounts isn't paranoia but responsibility. The mystery also reminds us that endings don't always come cleanly. That narrative closure belongs to fiction more than history. That reality resists neat conclusions, leaving loose ends and unanswered questions that frustrate our desire for completion. Hitler's story should end clearly, but it doesn't. This failure of narrative satisfaction teaches that history doesn't structure itself according to our psychological needs, doesn't provide the dramatic satisfactions we seek, doesn't organize itself into stories with clear resolutions. In the end, the mystery endures because human need to know exceeds our ability to prove, because historical truth depends on evidence that can be destroyed, because even the most documented events leave shadows where doubt persists. Hitler's death demonstrates that history itself contains mysteries as deep as any philosophical question, that modern science cannot always illuminate what darkness conceals, and that some uncertainties, perhaps, serve humanity better than false certainty ever could. The search continues. New technologies emerge. New documents get declassified. New witnesses' descendants provide DNA samples. New researchers apply fresh perspectives to old evidence. The investigation never truly ends because the question never receives answer so conclusive that all doubt vanishes. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps this mystery, uniquely among historical questions, should remain forever open, not because evidence is absent, but because certainty would be illusory, because closure would be premature, because some questions prove more valuable unanswered than resolved. We began in a bunker 30 feet underground, where natural light never penetrated and never will. We followed the investigation through Soviet archives, across continents, into DNA laboratories, through modern excavations using technology that seems like magic. We applied every tool humanity possesses for recovering historical truth. And we discovered that some truths resist recovery, that some mysteries persist despite our best efforts, that some questions remain forever beyond our reach. The bunker still exists beneath Berlin, sealed but present, a concrete monument to endings that refuse to end cleanly. The mystery persists in human consciousness, renewed with each generation that encounters it, sustained not by evidence, but by the absence where evidence should exist. And perhaps, in that absence, in that persistent uncertainty, in that forever open question, we find something more valuable than definitive answers, a reminder of history's complexity, of knowledge's limits, of humanity's ongoing struggle to understand its darkest chapters. The search for Hitler's fate mirrors humanity's broader search for truth in a world where truth proves elusive, where evidence can be destroyed, where political power corrupts historical inquiry, where certainty remains forever beyond reach. In that search, in that endless investigation, in that refusal to simply accept what we're told, perhaps we find not Hitler's fate but our own, condemned to seek what we cannot find, driven to question what cannot be answered, compelled to investigate mysteries that may never yield to investigation. And so the story ends where it began, in darkness, in uncertainty, in the space between what we know and what we can prove. The bunker remains, the mystery persists, the questions endure, and we, the living, continue searching for certainty in shadows, seeking truth in ruins, pursuing answers that recede before us like horizons visible but unreachable, present but forever distant, real but ultimately beyond our grasp.